It was 3 a.m. in Las Vegas. The blue-white glare of the International Hotel spotlights barely managed to mask the exhaustion of a man who had been on air for nearly 20 hours, Jerry Lewis. The auditorium air, dense with heat, smoke, and anxiety, pulsed to the rhythm of a televised marathon that had only one sacred objective: the monumental fundraising for the Muscular Dystrophy Association (MDA). Lewis, the comedian of millions, the heart of the telethon, was on stage, soaked in sweat but radiant beneath the armor of his black tuxedo, telling an innocuous joke that was meant to serve as a bridge to the next musical guest. But the audience sensed a change in the air even before the word was out. He stopped, not because of a mistake, but because a heavy, imposing figure, clearly out of context, breached the side security and began walking toward the center of the stage, interrupting the flow of the benefit night with the unmistakable gravity of a threat that had become real. The camera, professionally, tried to avoid the intruder, focusing on Lewis's static smile. But the silence that fell over the audience was more deafening than any scream of panic, a sound that only exists when comedy abruptly clashes with primal fear. The Las Vegas lights seemed to freeze the moment. The cigarette smoke floating in the air paused as if in reverence to the danger, and the face of the boss, pale under stage makeup that didn't belong to him, was the antithesis of humor, a dark representation of the dark world Lewis had spent his life trying to banish with laughter. The gangster approached the main microphone, his body exuding authority and unsaid violence, and Lewis's microphone, that object of power and hope, seemed to shrink in his hands. That man was not there for a check. He was there to break the show, to collect a debt that could not be paid with donations, and the message was clear. Lewis's life, and the credibility of the entire MDA operation, was suddenly at stake, depending on the reaction of one exhausted clown. Before we continue, if you want more powerful stories like this, please comment your opinion below, leave your like, and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue to bring intense accounts like this one. It was the year 1970, the peak of the Muscular Dystrophy Telethon, an event Jerry Lewis had built brick by brick, transforming it into a sacred institution, a beacon of hope that stretched for 24 continuous hours and personified Lewis's public image as the king of comedy. His devotion to my child, as he affectionately called the MDA, was unquestionable, a crusade that drained him physically and emotionally, but which represented the only purity he allowed in an often cynical world of celebrities. The telethon was not just a show. It was a front line against despair, and Las Vegas, with its casinos and its shadows, served as a contrasting stage, the place where generosity and greed walked side by side, where large sums of money were transferred with the same ease that grand promises were made, creating a perfect environment for the major figures of organized crime to infiltrate under the pretense of philanthropy. That event was Lewis's biggest target and his biggest nightmare, because every minute he knew he was exposed. Lewis, known for his controlling meticulousness, treated the telethon stage like a sanctuary, a place where humor and altruism could conquer the world's cynicism. But the Las Vegas backstage had always been an ecosystem apart, full of veiled interests, gambling debts, and connections Lewis preferred to ignore, but which occasionally manifested as terrifying ghosts in the middle of the day. The gangster, a figure known to be a powerful loan shark and an extortion orchestrator, had contributed to the show in previous years, using it as a social pass. But now, he was there with a demand much heavier than a simple favor, a requirement that threatened to dismantle the narrative of that night once and for all. Lewis knew, from whispers and veiled warnings from security, that the presence of that man there, at that moment, was not a gesture of charity, but a violent collection, an ultimatum demanding that a significant portion of that night's proceeds be diverted to cover a non-existent debt or a never-solicited favor. The audience, made up of major donors, celebrities, and the press, was there to witness the magic of hope and charity, and the sight of the visibly menacing man in the pinstripe suit walking to the center of the stage during prime time was the warning of a broken protocol that could turn into a televised tragedy. The clock on the side wall, a mundane object counting the telethon's remaining hours, suddenly became a countdown to panic, and the exhaustion in Lewis's eyes transformed into a steel glint, the flame of survival. He had spent dozens of hours there, selling the idea that human kindness was capable of moving mountains, and now he had to prove that theory, not against dystrophy, but against evil dressed in authority, in a silent duel where the only permitted weapon was his comedic timing. The weight of that event, the money raised, the trust placed by millions of viewers, all rested on Lewis's shoulders, and he couldn't simply walk off stage or yield to intimidation. He needed a plan that would honor the event and, at the same time, neutralize the threat without bloodshed or alarm. He looked at the gangster, whose cold gaze pierced his, and in that instant, Lewis ceased to be the clown. He became the general, the strategist. His mind, despite the sleep deprivation, was processing the threat in real time, seeking the flaw in his opponent's armor, the gap in his arrogance that could be exploited with a gesture, a word, a trick that only a master of the stage, with decades of improvisation, could execute. The tuxedo, which had previously seemed like a clown's uniform, now presented itself as armor, the last line of defense between chaos and dignity. The gangster, whom we will now call the Man in Black, wasted no time on formalities or euphemisms. He stopped just 3 feet from Lewis, ignoring the main microphone and speaking directly to Lewis, but with a voice loud enough for the silence of the audience to capture it like a boom. His opening line, according to later accounts, was a cold, authoritative whisper that paralyzed the sound technicians. "I'm here for my cut, Jerry. You know what it is. Unless you want this to be your last telethon." The threat was clear, not just physical, but existential for Lewis's cause. The background music, which should have returned, was aborted by a petrified stage director, and the only audible sound was the click of the press cameras that, suddenly, understood that the script had been burned and real drama had taken over the spectacle. The Man in Black was not smiling. The absence of any trace of humor on his face was what made the moment so terrifying in the context of that charity night. He took a step forward, almost invading Lewis's personal space, a gesture of dominance that, in any other environment, would be the immediate prelude to violence. He extended his hand, and it was not for a shake, but to grab Lewis's microphone, trying to silence the artist and assume physical control of the stage, a symbolic act of dispossession of voice and purpose. The focus of the cameras was, reluctantly, on the two men, the tension visible in the way Lewis recoiled minimally, his eyes capturing those of the Man in Black with an intensity that few people had seen before, a look that balanced instinctive panic with the cold fury of one who sees something sacred being profaned. The scene's turning point was instantaneous, an electric shock that ran through Lewis's exhausted body. The artist was replaced by the survivor. He realized, in a fragment of a second, that any sign of weakness would be fatal, not only for him, but for the MDA's fundraising. If he yielded to fear, the event would be ruined. The news of the extortion would sweep away the telethon's credibility and, worse, empower that shadowy figure. The only way out was not physical confrontation. He was at a disadvantage, but the subversion of the stage's reality itself. Lewis knew the Man in Black was a gangster. He was not a clown. He did not understand the rules of comedic timing, and would be the perfect target for Lewis's most powerful weapon, ridicule. Lewis then executed a micro-movement that would become legendary. He did not release the microphone, but yanked it back with a quick, dry wrist gesture, breaking the Man in Black's attempted possession with a speed that surprised everyone, especially the aggressor. In that instant, Lewis reclaimed control of his symbolic object, his scepter, and the dramatic turn was sealed. The clown would not give in. He looked at the Man in Black, and the gleam in his eyes was no longer exhaustion, but a newly discovered audacity, the courage of one who decides to bet everything on an improvised move. He would not talk about the threat, but would transform it into something else, something that the audience, though confused, could absorb as part of the show. Lewis moved quickly, a blur of motion unexpected for such a tired man, and took a wide step to the side, creating a strategic physical distance between himself and the Man in Black. This simple but decisive gesture forced the aggressor to reposition, momentarily breaking his superior posture and giving Lewis a micro-window of opportunity to reclaim the narrative. The comedian's body, previously curved with fatigue, straightened with a forced dignity, and the audience's silence became his canvas. He knew the gangster needed a quick and public victory to impose his authority, and Lewis was determined to drag him into a game of patience and comedy where he had no chance of winning. He looked briefly at the production members, who were paralyzed on the sidelines, their faces a mask of silent horror, and gave them an almost imperceptible wink. This micro-gesture was a clear command. Do not move. Do not interrupt. Lewis was taking total responsibility for the confrontation, transforming the danger into a solo performance. His breathing, which he tried to control, was the only external sign of his anxiety, an internal conflict between the fear of being hit and the duty to protect the cause. He grasped the microphone so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and the sound of his throat clearing, amplified by the sound system, was a sign that the real action was about to begin. In a brilliant turn of improvisation, Lewis made an elaborate face, one of his famous muggings, directing the exaggeration directly at the man in black, as if trying to frame him as an unwilling participant in his routine. The effect was immediate and disconcerting. A few in the audience, who had not grasped the severity of the initial threat, laughed. The laughter, a profane sound to the gangster's seriousness, acted as a first blow, a crack in the man in black's facade of authority, who frowned in confusion, his tense body torn between rage and the need not to ruin his public image with an exaggerated reaction. Lewis, sensing the hesitation, exploited the opening. He used the microphone to address the man in black, but with a voice laced with paternalistic sarcasm, pretending he was just an overly enthusiastic fan. Sir, if you haven't gotten your autograph yet, you won't get it by coming up on stage and scaring people. We have a schedule here. Millions are watching. The audience laughed a little louder, and the tension became ambiguous. The fear transformed into discomfort. But the show had not stopped, and that was Lewis's victory. He forced the man in black to conform to the rules of the stage, making him a target, and with every laugh, the threat was subtly disarmed. The man in black tried to speak again, his mouth opening to deliver the ultimatum, but Lewis interrupted him with perfect timing, an onstage instinct that bordered on clairvoyance. He began to hum the famous song Smile, a melody known for its melancholy, and at the same time, took the gangster's hand with a surprisingly strong grip, forcing the man in black to sway along with the music, like a ridiculous dance partner. The audience erupted in laughter. The image of Lewis, the clown, dragging the feared gangster into a comedy bit was so absurd that the tension temporarily broke, replaced by the shock of audacity and the power of laughter. However, the man in black managed to pull his hand back, his eyes now burning with a restrained rage, more dangerous than the initial threat. Lewis, realizing that the humor play had reached its limit, made a subtle transition. He moved back to the center of the stage, but this time, he placed the microphone at eye level, like a shield or a scepter, and his look at the gangster became one of pure disappointment, not fear. He was no longer acting for the public. He was confronting disorder on behalf of his children. The ambiguity of the situation, performance or real danger, kept the audience on edge. Doubt set in. Was this a planned bit, a dark comedy sketch, or were they witnessing the raw courage of a man being threatened? This uncertainty was Lewis's oxygen. He used a brief moment of silence to deepen his internal conflict, remembering the reason he was exhausted and sweating on that stage. The faces of the MDA children, the unwavering promise that he would not stop. His personal fragility was transformed into an unbreakable strength. Lewis then pointed to the clock on the side wall, the relentless countdown. "Look at the time, sir," he said, his voice returning to a more serious and solemn tone. "Everyone's time, including the time you are stealing from the children." He used the symbol of time not as a metaphor, but as a concrete truth. Every lost second was one less donation, one less resource in the fight against dystrophy. He was elevating the conflict from a personal dispute to a moral offense, forcing the man in black to acknowledge that his threat had consequences beyond money. The man in black, visibly uncomfortable at being placed in a position of public villain, where his violence was ineffective, took a hesitant step back. He could not attack Lewis without fully exposing himself and risking arrest, and the audience's laughter was a slow poison that undermined his authority. He looked at the microphone, an object he had tried to possess, and understood that the stage was Lewis's territory, a place where his money and power did not work against pure genius. Lewis, sensing the retreat, attacked once more, but this time with a subtle joke, an inside joke about fame. "I know what it is. You want me to introduce you as the next singer, right? Think you have the voice for it? Honestly, I think Dean Martin sang better than you, sir." The mention of Martin, his former partner, was a moment of shock and realization, a way for Lewis to deal with his own vulnerability by using the nostalgia of comedy, and it worked as a jolt to the audience. The joke, though acidic, humanized Lewis, showing that he was using all his tools, including his old hurts and memories. The tuxedo, which reflected the spotlights, became the center of attention again, and the man in black, dressed like a shadowy extra, looked increasingly smaller and more out of place. He became the object of ridicule, which was the definitive defeat for a man whose strength depended on the fear he inspired. Lewis took advantage of the pause to take a micro-step forward, reclaiming physical possession of the stage space, a subtle gesture that signaled to the production that everything was under control, or under his control at least. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. The showman was operating in crisis mode, and adrenaline was the only fuel left in his exhausted body. That moment of confrontation on stage, captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast to millions, cemented Lewis's legend. No longer just a man of funny faces and the squeaky voice. He was the warrior of charity, the man willing to face the darkness with a microphone in hand and a forced smile. He was playing the most dangerous game of his career, and the prize was much greater than any check. It was the survival of his honor and his cause. The man in black hesitated, looking at the faces of the audience who now stared at him with curiosity and amusement, and no longer with fear. His threat dissolved in the air. He could not carry out his ultimatum without becoming a public killer, and he was too smart for that. He had been lured into Lewis's arena, and the battle of wits and charisma he was catastrophically losing. The defeat was in his eyes. "I want to know your opinion about this moment. Comment on what you would do in this situation, facing a real threat in your workplace." Lewis then turned, his back to the man in black for a calculated instant, and pointed to the donation scoreboard, which continued to climb, slow but steady. This move was the final insult, an affirmation that the gangster's threat had not even stopped the flow of charity, that good was stronger than evil there, in that sanctuary of hope. When he turned around again, the man in black was almost at the edge of the stage, retreating. His body was tense, but his shoulders drooped slightly in defeat. He said nothing more, knowing that any word would be turned into a joke. Lewis had won the duel of intelligence, and the only thing left for the aggressor was the humiliating exit. The scene concluded with the man in black vanishing into the side shadows of the stage, swallowed by the darkness from which he had emerged. Lewis stood alone in the center, the microphone still in hand, his chest rising and falling with the accelerated rhythm of adrenaline, and the silence of the audience, which lasted only a second longer than necessary, was the proof that something extraordinary had occurred there, something that transcended the script and the comedy. Despite the man in black's exit, Lewis did not relax immediately. The accumulated exhaustion and the shock of the real threat acted like a lead weight on his shoulders, and he had to fight to maintain the performance mask before millions of eyes. The stage, which was his home, now felt like a newly won battlefield, but the scars of the fight were invisible and deep. He knew the gangster had retreated, but the real threat still hung in the air. The charity money was at risk, and the man in black would certainly try to collect his debt in a less public and more dangerous way, away from the cameras and the redeeming light. Lewis, with a superhuman effort of will, forced a smile, a gesture that looked painful and artificial. He knew the audience needed closure, a confirmation that the incident had been merely an untimely interruption and not a harbinger of violence. He pointed to the spot where the man in black had disappeared and, with a slightly hoarse voice, but with the impeccable timing of a master, said, "Well, looks like we found our first donor who tried to scare us instead of giving us a check. Someone please show him the exit and the donation form before he tries to raffle off his own tie." The laughter, which erupted in the audience, was a sound of cathartic relief, a release of the tension that had accumulated in the preceding minutes. Lewis had given the audience permission to laugh, transforming panic into a joke, and solidifying the image that he was in control, even if the cold sweat on his back told a different story. He used comedy as a collective defense mechanism, a shield that protected everyone in the auditorium from the gravity of the situation. The emotional urgency, however, increased for Lewis. He quickly looked at his producer backstage, and his eyes conveyed a silent command. Reinforce security. Don't let him return. But above all, do not stop the money count. The MDA cause was the momentum of that night, and any significant pause, any break in public belief, would be fatal to the fundraising. He realized that the true escalation was no longer physical, but moral. He had to sell normalcy with more conviction than ever. He moved to the front of the stage, assuming the position of an orator, and picked up the most important symbolic object of his cause, an MDA child, who was waiting to enter the scene. The contrast was brutal. The exhausted comedian, the stage empty of threat, and the innocence and vulnerability of the child in his arms. This gesture was not just for the public. It was for himself, a physical reminder of why he had risked his safety. The emotional weight of the child in his arms, light but loaded with meaning, increased the pressure on Lewis, reinforcing his devotion. He was not just defending himself against an aggressor. He was defending the hope and future of that child against the darkness of greed and threat. With every word of appeal he uttered, the connection between the danger that had just passed and the purity of his cause became more urgent and more poignant for the audience, elevating the drama to a level of personal sacrifice and silent heroism. The climax was not an act of violence, but a symbolic gesture of moral defiance that occurred the exact moment Lewis embraced the MDA child, an 8-year-old boy named Timmy, whose large eyes reflected the spotlights of the auditorium. Lewis looked at the camera, the exhaustion on his face suddenly replaced by laser clarity, and he knew he needed a final act that would leave no doubt about the nature of his struggle and the seriousness of his commitment, a definitive answer to the man in black's threat that would resonate with the public. With the child in his arms, Lewis began to speak, but not about the disease or the need for donation. He spoke about honor. "This man," Lewis said, looking directly into the main lens, his voice low and loaded with controlled fury. "The man who dared to come onto this sacred stage and demand a piece of hope, he does not understand the value of what is being built here." The direct, yet veiled, mention of the man in black at the height of emotion was the most risky and most courageous gesture of the entire night, a declaration of moral war. He then leaned in and whispered something into Timmy's ear, the boy, who smiled and nodded. Lewis straightened up, and the silence in the auditorium was absolute. The audience knew they were about to witness something that was not in the script. Lewis reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo, the same suit that seemed to have absorbed the tension of the night, and took out an object that gleamed under the light, his wristwatch, a valuable gift from Dean Martin, an item of incalculable value, both monetary and sentimental. In the grand symbolic gesture that defined the story's climax, Lewis did not just ask for more donations, he donated himself. He held up the watch, an object that represented the time he had dedicated and the time he had risked, and placed it in Timmy's hand, saying loudly enough for the microphone to capture every syllable, "This is worth more than any threat. Sell it. Use it for the cause. My time, my work, my life, it's all for you." The audience exploded in a wave of applause and sobs, realizing that the sacrifice surpassed any extortion. The victory of charity over greed had been sealed. The wristwatch scene triggered a wave of emotion and spontaneous donations that eclipsed the man in black's threat, proving that the power of the altruistic gesture was infinitely superior to brute force and greed. Lewis, exhausted, but with his soul purified by sacrifice, handed Timmy over to the care of a nurse, and the fundraising scoreboard began to climb vertiginously, each additional number being a direct denial of the gangster's ultimatum. The consistency of his motivation, the unwavering devotion to the MDA, was confirmed dramatically and publicly, turning the incident into an anecdote of heroism instead of an extortion scandal. Backstage, the impact of Lewis's act was felt immediately. The producers and security, previously panicked, reorganized with a renewed sense of purpose and loyalty. The event continued, but with a different emotional intensity, a palpable solemnity of those who had just witnessed a test of fire. Lewis's microphone, which had been his scepter and shield, was carefully placed on the stand, and he allowed himself a brief moment of vulnerability, closing his eyes for a second as the next guest walked onto the stage, as if absorbing the weight of his own audacity and the relief of having saved the night. The direct consequence of the climax was the total recovery of the narrative. The outside world, watching stunned, saw the artist Jerry Lewis not just as a comedian, but as a defender of unshakable character. The tuxedo, now crumpled and sweat-soaked, became the uniform of a war hero, and the MDA telethon gained a new layer of meaning. It was not just about money, but about the fight between light and shadow. The threat of organized crime was symbolically defeated by the courage of a man who used his art and his heart as his only and most effective weapon. Jerry Lewis continued the telethon for a few more hours, operating on pure willpower and adrenaline, but he was never just a clown again. That incident on stage cemented his legacy as a man of relentless courage, who knew that laughter, when used with purpose and honor, could be the most potent weapon against darkness. He had refused to break, to yield to fear, and instead forced the gangster to retreat to the anonymity from which he came, proving that not all power resides in violence or greed, but in the ability to inspire and give oneself for a cause greater than life itself. Lewis's story, in the end, is a vivid and brutal reminder that the stage of life rarely follows the script. True genius is not manifested only in moments of easy triumph, but in those instances of maximum tension, when exhaustion collides with danger and the individual must improvise, using their purest essence to subvert the threat. Lewis, with his comedic timing and emotional sacrifice, taught the world that art is, in its highest form, an act of resistance, a beacon of humanity that must shine brightest precisely when the shadows try to extinguish it. And in your opinion, what does the story reveal about the power of art and humor to face fear and extortion? Leave your comment